Hello, welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we'll be reviewing Past Lives. Written and directed by Celine Song in her feature directorial debut, Past Lives stars Greta Lee, Teo Yu, and John Magaro, and follows a reunion between two childhood friends as they contemplate their relationship and their own lives. So Matt, what did you think of Past Lives?
I am so glad we saw this movie and finally got a chance to see it because I absolutely loved this movie. This movie revolves around the narrative of a love triangle. The thing that this film does differently addresses these themes with a lot of humanity and respect and mutual understanding of all the characters, which I just really appreciated in this movie. And I thought is something that I hadn't seen. I think in your typical film with a love triangle, it's just everything's done for this huge dramatic heft and people fight and bicker, and this movie doesn't really have any of that. It has a really wonderful dialogue about these concepts, these feelings, and these emotions that these characters are dealing with, and it's something I immensely appreciated about this movie. So as you mentioned earlier, this film stars Greta Lee and Teo Yu, who play Nora and Hae Sung respectively. I just loved how this film really dealt with this concept of having a relationship and then learning how that progressed over the course of them getting older. There's a lot of things that are left unsaid or ways in which their immediate relationship ended.
So it's very hard to do, I think, both the intimate and the philosophical at once. Oftentimes you see great philosophical films, you see great films of tremendous human intimacy. You don't often see them mesh together. You don't often see them morph together in such like a nice synthesis the way that this film does. A lot of people have been comparing this to the Before series, and I think that's probably the best comparison, is that synthesis of the philosophical and the intimate. Outside of that, it doesn't have a ton to do with each other. Maybe we could talk about that later. I don't even know if we need to talk about it, but I think that this film pays such attention to human development, personal development, and its characters and their little traits that they learn to love about one another. And I felt like it was very fascinating for that. The film, for as personal and intimate as it is, has these really long sections of great philosophical inquiry that I found really fascinating, as well as I found, heart-rending.
Yeah, this movie takes a lot of its time developing these themes and a lot of these emotional beats that really pay off towards the end of the movie. It could seem a little bit slow-paced at first because it's really building this relationship between the two of them. It's showing a lot of their childhood, which may not necessarily feel like it's needed by the end of the movie, but it really is. And a lot of these little details that you had been mentioning really do pay off in the end.
When I was watching the first 2 acts of it, I was like, oh yeah, this is good. This is well written. But I was waiting for it to hit, and the last 40 minutes are like a banger. It's definitely extremely backloaded, and I think in a way that really benefits the film.
Yeah, and going from here, I think we should make mention that we will get into a lot of spoilers and details about the film, because I really would love to talk about this in more depth.
Yeah, agreed. We both like it, just in case. If you haven't seen the film and you want to bow out for spoilers, we both like it.
Yeah, but going from here, because this brought up a good point that I had a memory of during the film. In a general sense, I love how this film really develops these characters and a little bit of their psyches. There's this one little conversation that happens between Hae Sung and Nora about how she used to cry all the time as a kid. So she goes into all these details over Skype about like why she doesn't cry anymore and why she used to cry so much. There's this moment towards the end of the film where she does cry again. And what's so wonderful about this scene is that nothing needs to be said because her crying does all the expression in itself. And it also has a lot to say about her husband's character, Arthur, at the time, and the way he actually treats that moment, I think, is very telling about him as well.
Yeah, this film, it deals, we mentioned before, it deals with a lot of very weighty themes. One of those weighty themes is subjectivity and about the way that we view people versus the way that they view themselves. So there's this great line towards the end of the film where he says to Arthur, you're the one that stays, but to me, you're the one that leaves, which is really fascinating because the way that he's always thought of her is moving on to the next thing. Whereas the way her husband has always seen her is kind of this pillar of commitment, this pillar of staying. And you and I read a book recently called Less that's very good. And there's a line in it that I know resonated with you about how we think of people from when we began to know them. And we can't really conceive of who they were before that, which is something easy to put yourself in Arthur's shoes and say, she is the one who stays. So anyway, I found that really fascinating. You have all of these different perceptions of character colliding at once in those scenes. It's really fascinating.
Okay, so should we get to Arthur briefly? Because I think jumping right from that, I have something a bit relative to that.
Yeah,
is
sure.
that Arthur's struggle in this movie is dealing with his insecurity of not knowing her before when Hae Sung knew her. So there's aspects about her personality that he's not too familiar with or somebody else knows better about.
Yeah.
And so some of that comes out in these insecure ways. But what I love so much about his character is that he's almost like a pillar of the idea of what masculinity could be. Because, the toxic masculinity trait would be taking these insecurities and then throwing them on other people and lashing out in bad ways. Where so much of what I appreciate about his character is that he does have these insecurities, and you see them come out. When Hae-sung first visits into the apartment and he's on his phone, and he immediately drops it, but it hits with a little bit of a clang.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more dramatic in the sense of he's not just gently putting it down. He's like, oh God, here we go.
Yeah, and there's such discomfort in his face. When Hae-sung walks through the door, they have this almost like standoff. It is so painfully awkward. It must go on for 10 seconds. It's like the good, the bad, and the ugly, like how long that they're staring at each other. And then he finally reaches out and becomes warm. But you can see all of these emotions going through his mind at that time. He's struggling with this idea of not knowing his wife in the same way that somebody else will, but simultaneously accepting it. I think that his discomfort is very human, but I think the way that he accepts it is more human, if that makes sense. Arthur talks with his wife in bed about this idea that somebody could see something in you, a part of you that he'll never see in her, which I think really freaks him out. It leads to some of this insecurity. But I think Arthur ultimately learns to reconcile with this idea that you can have emotional intimacy outside of your marriage that is not necessarily romantic and not necessarily an infringement on your marriage, which I really liked. And I think it's a very progressive way to view the relationships in this movie. One of the reasons I like this film is a lot because of the film that it isn't. The film that it could be was she's in a disastrous marriage. Maybe it's something that even borders on abuse. So the morals become very clear and Hae-sung becomes her savior from that life, right? Or maybe she's just simply in a loveless marriage and Hae-sung is her white knight for that type of life. But this film doesn't do that. This film shows her in a fairly happy marriage, or at least a very competent and functional one. And these feelings come along that disrupt things a little bit, but in a way that I think is very restrained, very intelligent, and again, very human.
Yeah, that's exactly what I alluded to earlier when I mentioned that they didn't really do it for this dramatic heft. So many films that we see deal with love triangles do this, where they make it so dramatic and somebody's doing something, it's a betrayal, and somebody gets really insecure and they lash out. And it's just like, this film has none of that, which I love so much about it.
I thought it was funny how the film commented on this in a meta way. Arthur actually says it in bed, like, like they would be reunited in this love story and he would be in the middle and he would be the one keeping her from having her ideal life. I thought that was really funny because I was thinking about that even before you said it. It ties, I think, both to the subjectivity element, but also this huge theme of the life not lived, which this film alludes to in various ways. And even when the film is called Past Lives, and they talk about the idea that the life not lived, you're not living this life because of your past lives. You had perhaps lived it, or your future lives you intend to live it. So I think that's a really interesting point as well.
Going from there, one of the things I love about this movie is the mirroring in those themes and the images from the beginning of the movie to the end.
Yeah.
Mirroring images of them walking and separating for the first time and also the last time at the end of the movie. They're very similar scenes, but you notice how the characters treat that moment differently. They understand the meaning of what they need to say or do in that particular moment that they lacked in the first time.
You notice all of the face work in this movie? There's tremendous work on actors' faces, in particular from the second portion to the last portion, and the way that it transitions with Nora is she has this really bright, idealistic, enlightened face when in the second portion, the way it transitions into this kind of more muted face of middle age. It's the face that you see on just about every middle-aged person that you know, where life's troubles have kind of weighed on them a bit more. They're in a marriage that's, again, very good, very functional, but at the same time, they just simply have more worries being an adult than they did when, all of their dreams were in front of them as an aspirational student. There's a great scene in front of the carousel where they just miss each other and an eye contact portion that's just beautiful. Anyway, once I started noticing how good the actors were at their facial structure and their facial recognition, I started paying a lot more attention to it, and I was just fascinated by it.
Metaphorically, I thought that was presented a little bit with that conversation that Hae-sung would have with Nora every time they had talked to each other. He would always ask, what are your aspirations? Like, what award are you looking for now?
Oh, yeah.
And at first it was some really high, it was like a Pulitzer or something.
The first one was a Nobel Prize.
The first was the Nobel Prize, then a Pulitzer, then she hesitated and she said she doesn't think about those things anymore.
I think she said maybe a Tony.
After he pressed for it, she said maybe a Tony. But that just goes to exactly what you're saying, is that you see life is kind of weighing on her a little bit in the sense where she doesn't have as high aspirations as she used to because she realized maybe they're unattainable.
Completely, yeah. When you talk to a young person, they say, I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to be a filmmaker. And then at a certain point, you say, I'm going to work in alcohol distribution, or I'm going to film weddings. Or, there's like the more practical version of your dream arrives and you kind of make your life around that.
So jumping to one of the things you had mentioned was the carousel scene. And one of the things that made me think about was how this film is shot, because this film is gorgeous. And I don't know if it was just me, but I got a sense of some Wong Kar-wai style in this film.
Oh, definitely. Well, I mean, I don't know if this movie would even exist without Wong Kar-wai. And it's not to say that it's a mirror image of his film or anything, but this idea of two people that love each other to some degree and can't be together, and just this general intense longing throughout the picture. It was so Wong Kar-wai, but stylistically it's very different, I think, in tone.
Very different in tone, but I think from a visual representation, there were so many camera shots that I was like, that's like Wong Kar-wai. And it wasn't necessarily like the lighting. I know his lighting is very stark and, colorful and things like that. But I thought it was more about the positioning of the characters in the shots, because there were some shots that would change on screen and the character would be like somewhere else in the frame. It wasn't really this common thing of them being on the left 2/3 or the right 2/3, or like in the lower thirds of each side or directly in the center. It didn't really have that. The character would be up in the right corner at one point or down in the left corner. And sometimes you would have to go searching for where your main character was. There was one instance where Hae-sung is on the subway, and I was just like, where is he? And it took me like a few seconds to find him because the previous shot was completely different from that. And to me, that was very Wong Kar-wai, is just having characters in like different parts of the picture. But I loved that because it also played into a little bit of the longing or the searching that these characters were going through. They're trying to find something about themselves and their relationship with each other, and having to kind of find them in the scene. I don't know if I'm looking too much into it, but that's the way I kind of felt.
Yeah, there's that great scene in the park that I think is one shot, but it's very elegantly just falling, the shot. And you can see them from far away, and then they're hidden by a tree, and then it becomes more like a medium shot close up on them as they come closer. So I did lighting in high school, and what we always talked about when you were lighting a play was if nobody knew you were there, then you did a great job. And cinematography oftentimes can be very showy, and both cinematographers and directors and I guess production designers to some degree really want to show you their wonderful work. Whereas this film, I almost thought about the cinematography as an afterthought in a good way, because I was so enraptured with what was happening on screen that I then contemplated the shot and I said, oh, that was a 6-minute tracking shot along this street, right? By the way, sorry, tiny little nitpick. These people walk way too slow to be in New York. I don't know if you've ever... We visit New York a lot. We live really close to New York. When you're in New York, you gotta walk fast. These people are walking very leisurely, and it was giving me anxiety. But anyway, the way the film is shot, I think, is beautiful. I've said the word elegant, but I continue to say it just because I think it allows itself to be so subtly constructed that it doesn't just grasp for your attention for the sake of it.
That also reminded me of just how the camera and also the music and the audio lend itself so well to this very atmospheric feeling that the film had.
It's almost like wistful, the soundtrack, yeah.
The soundtrack is like this piano jazz, this very light, jazzy piano.
Sometimes it's just like almost these orchestral tones too. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the scoring, I think really finds itself in the right moments.
And I think that paired with these like stunning images of New York City, personally, I thought it was one of the most beautiful visual representations of New York City I think I've almost ever seen in film. I just left this feeling like, okay, when I think about New York City and how I feel about it, that's what I imagine. And it really captured that absolutely perfectly for me.
I think something that's easy to forget with this film too, because it leaves you with, such an emotionally powerful set of scenes, is that it's very funny and there are a lot of great character moments. There's a great scene in the beginning of the film where Nora's two parents are smoking in this one bedroom and they're like, no, don't come in. You stay in the hallway and say whatever you have to say. They're not even hiding the smoking. They just don't want their kids to breathe in the smoke of that one room. And I remember that from when I was a kid because my grandmother would only smoke in the bathroom and I wasn't allowed in the bathroom because that's where she would smoke. It was so funny. Such like a great little detail, such a great little character detail that I feel like it has to be pulled from real life somewhere.
Also, speaking of the way the film opens, I really enjoyed this.
I was gonna mention that. Yeah.
Because it opens with this couple that you just hear, you don't see. but they're at the bar talking about these three people, conversing about what they think their relationship to each other is. Like who is attached to who and what are their feelings and what are they thinking, which I found really hilarious because later in the movie, when they have that scene, they cut to one particular shot where Nora's gone to the bathroom and it's just Arthur and Haesung. In the background, you see the couple sitting at the table.
Oh, I didn't notice that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
And they're sitting there and they're like overtly in love with each other. They're kind of all over each other and kissing.
That's a good dichotomy of, in my opinion, what real love is, looking at those three people and the beginnings of love and infatuation, which is a very, very different thing. So you ready to go to grades?
I am ready to go to grades. I give this film an A. I really enjoyed it. It was one of my favorite movies of the year. Actually, might currently be my favorite movie of the year.
I was actually going to ask you at the end if it was your favorite movie of the year, if you had any other contenders.
There is a long way to go, and there's a lot of films to see. And I don't think we've seen anything particularly spellbinding.
I have without you.
Well, yeah, you said you had without me. So, for one, this is my most spellbinding movie. I would say, especially that last 40 minutes is quite spellbinding.
Last 40 minutes is a banger.
Some of the best cinema all year. For Celine Song's directorial debut, this film is absolutely fantastic. I just appreciate her attention to detail and the characters, building them and making sure that these emotional payoffs towards the edge of the film didn't feel forced on you. They just felt so natural and so unique to these specific characters. And I really enjoyed it for that.
And A24 is already funding and filming her next film.
Really?
Yeah, she's filming it this fall. So.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah. So I'm going to give this an A-. Nothing is really keeping it from being an A, aside from there's a couple other films this year that I like a little bit better. It's so tightly written, but so philosophically written at the same time. There's so many great lines in this movie. There's a line that Nora's mother says in the beginning that when you leave something, you gain something else. There were all these great one-liners that you could see becoming famous quotes later on, or even something to put on your refrigerator to remind you about what life is really about. There's so little negative to say. I think that it's just that maybe even though the first hour is so important to the last 40 minutes being a banger, there was like one or two check my watch moments for me, and that's really the only flaw I can think of. I think this film is absolutely wonderful. It's very rare that you see a film that makes me feel the way that this film does. We're talking like Her, we're talking the Before series, that particular blend of melancholy and inspiration that just makes you feel human. I don't mean to throw hyperbole out there, but it's a film that I think is very humanistic, natural, and empathetic, and it was just lovely to watch and lovely to see such great writing being produced. All right, so that's it for our review of Past Lives, which is now playing in theaters. Please support this in cinemas, go see it in theaters. Let us know what you think in the comments, and we will see you next time.